November 1944, Hurtgen Forest. Zero visibility from dense fog and artillery smoke. I fall into a shallow German trench, mud covering my face. 3 meters away, the silhouette of a German soldier turns, raising a Kar 98K rifle. I try to lift my M1 Garand, but the 60-centimeter barrel hits the damp dirt wall. The space is too tight. The metallic click of the German bolt echoes. I drop the rifle, reach to the leather holster on my hip, unfasten the snap, draw over 1 kilogram of cold steel, and pull the trigger without aiming. The confined roar of a .45 ACP shot drowns out every other sound. The visible impact of a 230-grain projectile throws him backward, ending the threat instantly. They tell you artillery wins the war, but when the enemy breathes the same dirty air as you, the only thing that matters is if what you hold can drop him before he kills you. That right there is the physical reality of stopping power. Today, we are going to look at the raw physics behind the .45 ACP and why it dropped targets that European ammunition often punched right through. You will see why firing an M1911 in actual combat was a logistical and physical challenge that tested every nerve a soldier had under fire. And we will break down the specific mechanical detail John Browning built into this steel frame back in 1911 that kept it cycling even when we dragged it through the heavy, wet mud of the Normandy bocage. This is the truth about fighting at 3 meters, where rifles fail and you rely on the massive kinetic energy of a flying rock. If you want the version of this war that they do not put in the standard textbooks, the one lived in the dirt and the noise, stay with me. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. In Europe, the doctrine told us this was a war of heavy infantry and artillery. The manual said we would fight at medium to long distances, relying on the firepower of the M1 Garand from 200 to 400 meters out. Historically, a pistol was a badge of rank for an officer or a weapon of last resort, not a frontline tool. But the manual did not account for the bocage in France or the tight, twisting streets of German villages. The war shrank. It collapsed from open fields down to the distance of a narrow hallway or a single room. When you carry 30 kilograms of gear and the fight drops to a 5-meter range, a meter-long rifle becomes a liability. We needed something else. The solution was hanging heavy against our right legs, an uncomfortable weight we prayed we would never have to draw. The tight spaces forced our hands. People think soldiers ran through the streets firing pistols like characters in an action theater. The truth is much colder. Using a pistol in a war dominated by rifles and machine guns meant something had gone wrong. It meant your primary weapon jammed, you ran dry on ammunition, or the enemy had crossed your final line of defense. The M1916 leather holster slapped against your leg all day, holding 1.1 kilograms of loaded metal. You felt every gram of it. It was not a precision instrument designed for sniper work. It was a heavy block of steel meant for desperate survival. In those claustrophobic encounters at less than 15 meters, we possessed an advantage the Axis troops did not. We had the destructive inertia of the .45 automatic Colt pistol cartridge, designed specifically to end a fight the moment it connected. The history of that heavy bullet was written in blood long before we reached Europe. The origin of this doctrine goes back to the Philippine insurrection between 1899 and 1904. The American troops fighting there realized quickly that their .38 long Colt revolvers lacked the power to stop charging warriors. A lighter, faster bullet often failed to prevent an attacker from closing the distance and using a blade. The Army demanded a caliber that would knock a target down and keep them there. They needed a hammer, not a scalpel. By 1911, they adopted John Browning's design after it fired 6,000 rounds without a single malfunction during testing. They refined it in 1924, adding a shorter trigger and an arched mainspring housing, calling it the M1911A1. It was ready for the next global conflict. We carried the result of that history on our belts. The requirement was simple: transfer maximum kinetic energy upon impact. We called it stopping power, and it dictated how we fought when the enemy got too close for comfort. The German infantry we faced carried the Kar 98K, or the MP-40 submachine gun. Their standard pistol and submachine gun round was the 9 Caus 19mm Parabellum. It was a light, fast projectile, traveling at 350 to 400 meters per second. It had excellent penetration, but in close-quarters combat, that penetration became a flaw. We saw instances where a 9mm round would pass clean through a target. The enemy soldier might bleed out eventually, but his nervous system did not register the immediate structural collapse needed to stop him from pulling a trigger or thrusting a bayonet. The European doctrine focused on velocity. The American doctrine focused on mass. We had a heavy, fat bullet that operated entirely differently upon striking a soft target. When the distance closed and the light grew dim inside a bunker, you did not want a bullet that went through. You wanted a bullet that stayed. The physics were about to show their teeth. The 45 ACP is a massive 230-grain projectile weighing 14.9 grams. It leaves the muzzle of an M1911 at a sluggish 253 meters per second. Because it is subsonic and wide, it lacks the aerodynamic profile to pierce cleanly through a human body. Instead, it acts like a flying brick. Upon impact, it decelerates rapidly, discharging all its kinetic energy into the surrounding tissue at once. This creates massive blunt force trauma. The mathematics of this interaction result in a systemic shock, causing the immediate collapse of the muscular and nervous systems. This is the true definition of stopping power. It is not magic. It is the mechanical transfer of energy to halt an advancing threat. When a German soldier is charging with a bayonet just 1 meter from your chest, you do not have 10 seconds to wait for him to realize he is fatally wounded. You need him to hit the dirt right now. The heavy bullet guaranteed that structural failure. The M1 Garand dominates at 300 meters, but jumping into a narrow trench with it is a different story. The long barrel catches on roots, sandbags, and door frames. In close quarters, every fraction of a second you spend untangling your rifle is a moment the enemy uses to aim. That is when you transition to the pistol. But relying on the M1911 brought its own set of strict limitations. You only had 7 rounds in the single-stack magazine, plus 1 in the chamber. 8 shots total. There was no suppressing fire, no spraying a room to keep heads down. Every single pull of the heavy trigger had to count. You carried the constant anxiety of a limited capacity, counting the shots in your head while the air filled with the sharp smell of cordite. Firing it required you to keep the weapon in condition 1, a round chambered, the hammer cocked back, and the manual thumb safety engaged. You lived on a razor edge. The secret to the pistol's reliability in the dirt and mud was John Browning's short recoil operation. When you fire, the barrel and the slide lock together and move backward for a few millimeters. They stay locked until the gas pressure in the chamber drops to a safe level. Then, a small link tilts the barrel downward, unlocking the action, extracting the spent casing, and feeding a fresh round. This mechanical absorption of the recoil allowed the gun to fire high-pressure ammunition while maintaining its durability. The heavy steel slide clacking backward was a sound you felt in your wrist as much as you heard. It powered through soot, carbon buildup, and the gritty European mud. The tolerances were loose enough to keep cycling when dirt got inside, but tight enough to drop a man at 10 paces. I want to know what you actually thought the M1911 was used for before you heard this. Drop it in the comments. We entered a German village in the winter of 1944. The combat distance shrank instantly from 300 meters down to 3 meters. The fighting moved from street corners to basements and narrow stairwells. This is where the myths about the handgun shatter against reality. You might hear stories of the average American soldier firing an M1911 one-handed, dropping targets with ease at 50 meters. The truth is, the M1911 was notoriously difficult for new recruits to master. It was heavy, weighing over a kilogram, with a short sight radius and a severe recoil. Most of us knew that firing it beyond 15 meters in the chaos of a firefight was just a quick way to empty a magazine into the dirt. It was a weapon of desperation, used at point-blank range. If you were drawing your pistol, It meant the perimeter had fallen, and you were fighting for your life with the enemy close enough to smell the damp wool of his uniform. There is another common error you hear today. People say Axis soldiers feared the M1911 more than they feared our machine guns or artillery. No infantryman fears a handgun more than a mortar barrage. Artillery is what keeps you awake at night. But at the level of hand-to-hand combat, down in the mud of a cleared room, German troops recognized the lethal superiority of the .45 caliber. They knew their 9mm rounds lacked the immediate stopping capability of our heavy lead. They prized captured American pistols as trophies and status symbols. For us, it was not a trophy. It was an insurance policy against an imminent threat. When a soldier was forced to use it, his hands were sweating, his heart hammering against his ribs. Firing a .45 under those conditions is like wrestling with angry steel. You feel the massive recoil driving the grip hard into the bones of your palm, forcing the muzzle toward the ceiling with every single shot. The true cost of the weapon was the demand it placed on the shooter. The physical act of drawing the M1911 under fire required muscle memory burned in through repetition. The leather holster held the weapon tight. Your thumb had to sweep down, disengage the thumb safety, and ensure your grip depressed the safety lever on the backstrap. If your hand placement was wrong, the gun simply would not fire. In a dark room where a German MP40 is already chattering out bursts of 9mm, a dead trigger means you are dead. We had no space to bring our rifles to bear. The enemy fire chipped the stone walls, filling the air with dust and flying masonry. The false security of the village vanished as the fight devolved into a primal struggle inside a small stone house. You could not see the sky. You could only see the muzzle flashes illuminating the gray uniforms in the gloom. The margins for error disappeared entirely in that house. We pushed into the basement of a fortified position, an underground bunker complex. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of stale sweat and diesel. A sergeant took the lead, stepping into a space barely 4 meters wide. He moved methodically, his M1 Garand raised, clearing the corners. The darkness swallowed the weak light filtering down from the stairs above. Suddenly, a figure lunged from a dark corridor. The sergeant fired his rifle, dropping the first threat, but the clip ejected with that unmistakable metallic ping. The rifle was empty. He had no time for the 3 seconds it takes to fetch a fresh en-bloc clip from his belt, align it, and smash it down into the receiver. A second enemy soldier charged out of the gloom, his rifle leveled, a long steel bayonet fixed to the muzzle. The distance was closing fast. The sergeant's primary weapon was now just 3.5 kilograms of useless wood and metal. The German soldier committed to the lunge, his boots scraping loudly against the concrete floor. The sergeant let go of the Garand. It fell, caught by its canvas sling, hanging against his chest. His right hand dropped to his hip, his fingers closing around the cold, rough Coltwood plastic grips of his pistol. He pulled the heavy steel frame clear of the leather, his thumb automatically swiping the safety lever down with a sharp, dry click. He brought the gun up, leveling the massive 11mm dark hole of the muzzle at the center of the approaching mass. He did not use the sights. The lighting was too poor and the target was too close. His forearm locked tight, muscles straining to manage the impending muzzle flip. He knew he only had a handful of heavy rounds to solve the problem in front of him. What happens next took less than 4 seconds. 4 seconds that ended 81 days. He pulled the short trigger. The concussive roar of the .45 ACP detonating in a closed concrete basement was deafening. The shockwave hit our eardrums like a physical blow, vibrating right through our teeth. A flash of light erupted from the barrel, illuminating the space for a fraction of a second. The heavy slide slammed backward, extracting and ejecting the brass casing, and stripped a new round from the magazine as it drove forward. The recoil shoved his hand hard, but his locked wrist forced the muzzle back down into alignment. He fired a second time, and then a third, the rapid reports blending into a continuous, deafening wall of sound. The smell of freshly burnt smokeless powder instantly overpowered the diesel and sweat in the air. The physical impact of the heavy lead hitting flesh was not clean. It was a massive transfer of kinetic energy meeting biological resistance, acting as a mechanical brake on a human body in motion. The first 230-grain projectile struck the charging soldier directly in the collarbone. The sheer weight and inertia of the round spun him hard to the side, breaking his forward momentum instantly. He did not stumble forward. His body twisted off its axis. The second round caught him squarely in the center of the chest. The bullet did not pass through his back. It dumped almost 500 joules of energy directly into his torso in an instant. The blunt trauma shocked his central nervous system, collapsing his muscular control. His legs folded underneath him, and he hit the concrete floor heavily, the rifle clattering away into the dark. The threat was neutralized entirely by the rapid deceleration of mass. The German soldier never even managed to extend his arms for the bayonet thrust. The heavy ammunition did exactly what John Browning designed it to do. It stopped a moving threat dead in its tracks at a distance of less than 2 meters. The silence that followed the gunfire felt heavier than the noise. My ears rang with a sharp, permanent whine, the acoustic trauma of discharging a short-barreled weapon in a confined space without ear protection. The sergeant stood there, his chest heaving, his right wrist aching from the sharp recoil of firing 3 rapid shots. He kept the muzzle pointed at the floor, his finger off the trigger. A thin wisp of smoke curled lazily out of the ejection port. He did not celebrate. He just took a ragged breath and hit the magazine release, catching the steel box in his left hand. He had 4 rounds left. He slid a fresh 7-round magazine into the grip and racked the slide, chambering a new round. The metallic clack-clack was loud in the ringing silence. The weapon was dirty, coated in soot and grit from the basement, but the loose tolerances of the short recoil system kept it functioning flawlessly. We moved past the fallen soldier and cleared the rest of the bunker. The tactical situation had deteriorated, the rifle had run dry, and the primary doctrine had failed. In that critical gap between life and death, the M1911 fulfilled its only real purpose. It kept an American soldier alive when the geometry of the fight turned against him. We checked the enemy's weapon later. It was a Kar 98K, a fine rifle, chambered in a powerful 8mm cartridge. But in that confined space, power without rapid delivery and immense terminal shock means nothing. The German needed space to employ his weapon effectively, space to aim and thrust. The American doctrine, relying on the heavy pistol for the final few meters, provided a severe countermeasure. The heavy bullet did not require precise placement in a vital organ to stop the fight. The massive kinetic dump of the .45 ACP ensured that any solid hit to the torso would break the attack. When you examine the mechanics of that encounter, you understand why the 9mm failed to gain our trust during that war. If the sergeant had been using a captured Luger, the lighter, faster bullet might have punched cleanly through the lung or shoulder. The enemy would have sustained a fatal wound, yes, but he would have possessed enough residual oxygen and adrenaline to complete his bayonet thrust before his brain registered the damage. We saw it happen. The .45 ACP removed that deadly delay. It acted as an immediate anchor. The physical weight of the bullet compensated for the chaos and the lack of precision inherent in close-quarters battle. You aimed for the center mass and let the physics of the 230-grain projectile do the heavy lifting. The sheer concussive force transferred upon impact disrupted the skeletal structure and knocked the wind out of the target, shutting down the body's ability to coordinate an offensive motion. The tactical reality of the European theater proved that while the rifle won the engagements, the pistol won the ambushes. We did not use the M1911 to assault positions. We used it to survive the sudden, terrifying moments when the enemy breached our personal space. The gun was heavy, it was uncomfortable, and it demanded constant maintenance to keep the leather holster from rotting in the damp French weather. But when the bolt on your Garand locked back empty and a shadow moved in the doorway, that heavy block of Parkerized steel was the most valuable object in the world. It was a tool of finality. It did not wound to incapacitate later. It shattered the immediate capability of the enemy to fight back. The sergeant survived that basement because of a mechanical design from 1911 and a bullet concept born from the jungles of the Philippines, applied directly to the concrete bunkers of Germany. The math collected its toll. We carried the physical and mental costs of those encounters long after the bunkers were cleared. The constant ringing in our ears never truly faded, a permanent souvenir of firing heavy ordnance indoors. Our wrists and forearms carried a deep, dull ache from managing the recoil of the 45 ACP under stress. Tactically, the objective was secured, and the unit moved forward to the next street, the next house, the next dark basement. But the human cost lingered in the shaking hands that reached for a canteen and the dry mouths that struggled to swallow. We learned to respect the tools that kept us breathing. The M1911 was never a weapon you loved to carry, but it was a weapon you learned to trust implicitly when the world narrowed down to a single room. It was the ultimate insurance policy, paid for in the weight we hauled and cashed out in the kinetic energy it delivered when we needed it most. The legacy of the M1911 and the 45 ACP forged the American legend of stopping power. It shaped the handgun doctrine of the United States military for decades to follow. The weapon remained our standard-issue sidearm until 1985. When they finally replaced it with the 9mm Beretta, it sparked deep resentment among veterans who remembered the tight spaces of Europe and the Pacific. We did not trust the faster, lighter European caliber. We remembered what worked when the chips were down. Even today, special operations units like Marine Force Recon and Delta Force have demanded and utilized modern variants of the 1911. They understand what we learned the hard way in the bocage and the bombed-out villages. When you have to clear a room and end a close proximity threat with a single, well-placed shot, nothing replaces the massive displacement of a heavy bullet. The foundation built by John Browning proved practically indestructible. I look back at those days and the grand strategies of generals fade away. What remains is the memory of the cold metal grip in my palm, the sharp smell of Hoppa's No. 9 solvent mixed with burnt powder, and the heavy weight of the M1916 leather holster pulling against my belt. We did not win the war with pistols, but thousands of us came home because of them. When the artillery stopped and the rifles ran dry, survival came down to the heavy inertia of a 230-grain bullet flying through the dark. That pistol was not a symbol of authority. It was the final barrier between living to see tomorrow and dying in a muddy trench thousands of miles from home. It was the blunt force of reality in a 1-kilogram package of steel. If this story deserved to be told, make sure someone else gets to hear it.